In Georgie and Mandy's First Marriage, a narrative that explores love, loss, and personal growth, Georgie's visits to his father's grave are an intriguing and symbolic element. His trips to the cemetery represent both a literal and metaphorical pilgrimage, where he confronts his past, grapples with lingering emotions, and attempts to find closure in the wake of his father's death. As the story progresses, it raises the question: will Georgie's visits to his father's grave become a regular part of his life, or will they fade into the past as he continues to move forward? The answer is not immediately clear, but it is rooted in the broader themes of the story and Georgie's evolving relationship with his past, his family, and his own sense of self. The cemetery, where Georgie encounters his father's tombstone, serves as a place of both physical and emotional weight. This grave is not just a marker of his father's physical absence. It represents an emotional tether, pulling Georgie back into a time when his relationship with his father defined much of his world. As with many people who experience the loss of a parent, Georgie's visits are likely a way of holding on to something that can no longer be touched or interacted with in the way he wishes. However, the notion of Georgie's visits becoming a regular routine is more complex than it might first appear. One of the key dynamics of Georgie and Mandy's first marriage is Georgie's struggle to find balance between his past and his present. His relationship with Mandy, the other central figure of the story, represents a break from his past, a chance to build a new life that is not haunted by the same emotional baggage he has carried for years. In this sense, his visits to his father's grave might not only be a reflection of grief, but also a means of holding on to a past that no longer serves him, a reminder of things he might need to let go of in order to fully embrace his future. Mandy, as Georgie's partner, plays a key role in this dynamic. She too is affected by the specter of the past, her own past, which also shapes her actions and relationships. While Mandy and Georgie's relationship is a grounding force in his life, it also represents a new chapter, one that may require Georgie to release certain emotional anchors that no longer fit into the narrative he is trying to write for himself. This tension between past and present, between holding on and letting go, is central to the story and adds depth to Georgie's relationship with his father's memory. For Georgie, the cemetery is a place of reflection, but it is not necessarily a space that demands constant engagement. His visits, in the early parts of the story, seem to be driven by a need to understand who he is and how he fits into the world after the loss of a significant figure. This is not an unusual impulse for anyone who has experienced the death of a parent. The act of going to the grave can serve as a form of seeking answers to questions that remain unresolved, questions about identity, legacy, and the impact of that person's life on the course of one's own. Yet, as the narrative unfolds, there is a distinct possibility that these visits may become less frequent. Georgie's relationship with his father, as depicted in the story, was complicated and fraught with unspoken issues. His father's death, while undoubtedly a source of grief, may have also left Georgie with unresolved feelings of anger, resentment, or even guilt. Over time, as he continues to evolve as a person, these emotions might soften or shift in ways that render his father's grave less of an emotional focal point. There is also the question of how Georgie's emotional healing might affect his need to visit the grave. In the early stages of grief, it is common for individuals to feel a strong pull to be near the site of a loved one's burial. The grave becomes a place of solace, where one can still feel a connection to the person who has passed. However, as time goes on and healing takes place, that connection may shift. Georgie's development as a character, particularly in his relationship with Mandy, suggests that he may eventually come to terms with his father's death in a way that allows him to move forward without the need for regular visits to the cemetery. This process of moving forward is not necessarily about forgetting the past, but but rather about integrating it into a new understanding of who Georgie is and who he wants to be. If Georgie's visits to his father's grave become less frequent, it could signify a shift in his emotional state, perhaps a recognition that he is no longer defined by his father's absence, but by his own choices, relationships, and personal growth. The grave, once a site of unresolved feelings, might transform into a symbol of acceptance and closure, allowing Georgie to honor his father's memory without needing to physically return to the place of his death. Another factor that could influence Georgie's future visits to his father's grave is the development of his own family. As he and Mandy build their lives together, they may begin to establish their own traditions and ways of coping with grief. Mandy's presence in Georgie's life could provide him with the support and understanding he needs to find closure in ways that don't involve ritual visits to the cemetery. Alternatively, Mandy might help Georgie understand that grieving and remembrance can take many forms, some of which are more internal or symbolic than physical. In this sense, Georgie's visits to his father's grave might become less about obligation and more about choosing how to honor his father's memory in ways that align with his evolving sense of self. Ultimately, whether or not Georgie's visits to his father's grave become a regular part of his life is less about the visits themselves and more about the emotional journey they represent. These visits are part of a larger process of mourning, self-discovery, and acceptance. As Georgie navigates his relationship with Mandy, with his past, and with his father's memory, it is likely that the need to visit the grave will evolve in tandem with his growth. Whether he continues to make regular visits, reduces their frequency, or eventually ceases altogether, the important point is that Georgie's relationship with his father, through life and death, remains an integral part of his ongoing journey,